In the middle of a raging blizzard, a young Marine freezes in shock, because just ahead of him, a German shepherd mother is tied to a post, her pups half buried in snow, and her desperate eyes begging him to save something more, something still hidden in the storm. Today's story follows his fight against the storm as he uncovers a missing family, a mother's final act of love, and the miracle that unfolds when courage meets faith. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The winter storm swallowed Port Hawkins in a wall of white, the wind sweeping through the coastal streets like a cold, unfeeling tide. Sergeant Luke Harper gripped the steering wheel of his dark SUV as it moved slowly along the frozen shoreline road. At 30 years old, Luke carried the strength of a Marine who had given a decade of his youth to the battlefield, and the quiet exhaustion of someone who had seen enough loss to last a lifetime. His face was angular, all sharp lines and shadowed planes, with a rugged jaw that bore the faintest hint of dark stubble. His eyes, a steady gray blue, held the alert focus of a man who never really stopped scanning for danger even when on leave. His black hair was cut close to the sides in the habit of military order, though a few strands had begun to fall longer over his forehead during his rare weeks home. Beside him sat Bear, his 4-year-old German shepherd, large and powerfully built, with a thick sable and black coat, now dusted in stray flakes of snow. Bear's ears twitched as a gust rattled against the windows, his amber eyes bright with instinct. Trained for search and rescue operations, Bear was vigilant by nature, the kind of dog who rarely slept deeply, always attuned to Luke's voice and the world around them. He had a faint scar above one paw, a mark left from shrapnel during a mission overseas, and though healed, it made his gait ever so slightly uneven in the cold. But his spirit remained fierce and loyal, the eagerness in his gaze unchanged. Luke exhaled slowly, watching the world vanish and reappear in the shifting blizzard. He had planned for a quiet winter break, long walks near the docks, warm food, maybe even a night where he slept without waking at every distant noise. Yet life had always found him in the middle of storms, both literal and otherwise. He sometimes wondered whether peace simply wasn't built for men like him. As he approached the small slope near the harbor, Bear lifted his head sharply. A low growl rumbled in the dog's chest, not aggressive but alert, a sound Luke had learned to trust without question. Luke eased the SUV to a stop. The wipers, strained under ice, beat their futile rhythm on the glass as the outside world blurred into indistinct white. "What is it, boy?" Luke murmured. Bear pressed his nose to the window, ears rigid. Luke stepped out, bracing himself as the cold struck like needles driving into his skin. The wind howled down from the ridge, carrying the scent of seawater and frozen pine. Snow spiraled sideways, blinding, disorienting. But then Luke saw it, a shape flickering in and out of view, low to the ground, trembling against a metal post. He moved closer, boots crunching heavily through drifts. The figure resolved into a German shepherd mother, her coat a rich mixture of brown and tan, now stiff with ice, patches of frost clinging to her fur like shards of broken glass. A frayed rope was tied tightly around her chest and looped cruelly to the post. Her breath came in shallow clouds, each one weaker than the last. At her feet were 3 puppies, each no larger than his hand, curled helplessly in a shallow indentation in the snow. Their tiny bodies shivered uncontrollably, their fur damp from the storm. One lifted a paw weakly and let out a faint whine. Luke's chest tightened. He knelt immediately, his knee sinking into the freezing powder. My God, who did this to you? His voice cracked in disbelief and anger, though he kept it soft, steady, hoping to soothe the frightened mother. The dog raised her head with visible effort. Her eyes, dark and exhausted, carried something that struck Luke deeper than any battlefield memory. Trust. Not fear, not aggression. A plea. Bear trotted over and stopped beside Luke, his posture alert yet gentle. He lowered his head and sniffed the pups, giving a soft, encouraging whoof. The mother let out a thin, trembling bark, an almost desperate sound that wavered with urgency rather than threat. She turned her gaze sharply toward the snow-covered line of pine trees at the far end of the road. Luke followed her stare. Nothing visible, just the storm. But Bear suddenly straightened, his tail dropping low but tense. He barked once toward the trees, sharp and decisive. A signal. Luke felt it in his gut. Something else was out there. Something the mother had not abandoned. Something she needed him to find. His pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of the old instinct that still lived inside him. The one that rose whenever a life hung by a thread and someone had to act before time froze the world into silence. He looked down at the trembling dog family, then back toward the forest's edge, where the wind bent the branches into bowed silhouettes like warning hands. "All right," Luke whispered, rising slowly. "We'll find whatever you're trying to show us." Bear stood ready, eyes fixed ahead. The storm screamed around them, but beneath its fury began the quiet shift of fate, the kind that arrives without warning in the middle of an ordinary night, demanding courage from those who still remember how to give it. Luke tightened his coat, braced his stance, and stepped toward the white abyss waiting beyond the road. The chapter ends here, with his decision made. Bear shot ahead the moment Luke opened the SUV door, his paws kicking up clouds of powdery ice as he bounded toward the spot where the mother dog had desperately pointed. Luke secured the 3 shivering puppies inside his coat, their tiny bodies trembling against his chest, then bent low against the brutal wind that slanted sideways through the winter woods. Branches groaned under the weight of snow, and the narrow path ahead seemed to dissolve into drifts that swallowed every shape and shadow. The mother dog struggled behind them, her legs weak but her resolve fierce, pushing through the snow with the stubborn, unyielding loyalty of a creature who had endured far more than her small frame should have carried. Luke kept one hand over the puppies, and the other stretched toward the mother whenever she faltered, murmuring encouragement. His breath fogged against the icy air, turning to crystals along the edge of his scarf. Bear paused once, glancing back at them with urgent amber eyes, before plunging deeper into the trees. Luke followed, trusting the dog's instincts, trusting the unspoken language built through years of missions where Bear had led him to wounded Marines, lost hikers, and even once, a child trapped beneath the collapsed roof of a farmhouse. Bear had a way of sensing life where others saw only debris. The forest swallowed the group in a muted stillness, broken only by the distant roar of the storm overhead. Then Bear stopped. Luke saw his dog's tail stiffen in that unmistakable way that always preceded a discovery. Bear lowered his snout, sniffed intently, then began scraping furiously at a mound of snow near a bent pine trunk. Luke knelt beside him, using his bare hands though the cold stabbed painfully at his fingers. Snow scattered, clinging to his sleeves, until something beneath the surface shifted weakly. There, curled tightly, as if trying to disappear into the winter, was a 4th puppy. Smaller than the others, its fur damp and patchy with frost, its breathing fragile and shallow. Luke swiftly lifted the tiny creature, wrapping it in his wool scarf, then held it close to his chest where his own body heat could seep into its fading life. The mother dog let out a soft whine, nudging his arm with her icy nose, and Luke felt a sting of emotion rise behind his stern exterior. "You held on for them," he whispered to her, "even when it would have been easier to lie down and let the snow take you." As he shifted to stand, something caught his eye. Near the overturned snow sled lay a canvas backpack, half buried under rime. Its fabric, once blue, was nearly colorless beneath the ice. Luke brushed off the top, unzipped it, and found a folded photograph resting inside a plastic sleeve. The picture showed a smiling woman with wavy dark blonde hair pulled loosely behind her shoulders. Her face was gentle, with soft features and warm brown eyes framed by faint lines that suggested she laughed often before fear had found her. Beside her stood a boy around 7 years old with sandy hair sticking out beneath a wool cap, his grin wide and carefree. At their feet sat the same shepherd mother now trembling beside Luke, but in the picture she looked healthy, alert, proud. Tucked behind the photo was a crumpled note. The ink had run slightly, but the message remained painfully readable. "If someone finds them, please save the pups. I will come back for them. I promise. Emily." Luke inhaled slowly, letting the icy air burn through his chest. Whoever Emily was, she had not abandoned these animals. She had fought to keep them alive in a storm capable of swallowing a grown adult. She had tied the mother where someone might pass, hoping for a miracle. She had left her name behind, not out of guilt, but out of desperation. Bear lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked. He stepped away from the sled, nose pointed into the shifting snowfall beyond the clearing. Luke followed his line of sight. Just past a crooked spruce branch, fresh indentations spread across the snow, deep, uneven tracks from boots, heading further toward the cliffs that bordered the coastline. They were partially filled by new snow, but not enough to hide their direction. Someone had recently been here. Someone who had fought their way into the storm and perhaps never returned. The mother dog barked suddenly, the sound thin but insistent, and took several staggering steps toward the tracks before nearly collapsing. Luke rushed to support her, steadying her body with one arm. Bear barked once, sharply. Luke knew that tone. Not danger, not threat, urgency. He pulled the fourth puppy closer to his chest and examined the tracks again. Whoever had made them was either in dire need or already beyond help. His military training urged caution in the storm, but the Marine in him refused to turn away from what these signs pointed toward. At that moment, through the screen of falling snow, a faint shape moved between the trees. Luke froze, tightening his grip instinctively. But as it came closer, he recognized a human figure trudging toward them. It was an older man in a thick brown parka, carrying a long wooden walking stick. Snow layered his shoulders and hood. His beard was full and white, trimmed neatly despite the storm. His cheeks were red from the cold, and he moved slowly, with the deliberate steps of someone used to harsh winters. When he finally reached them, he lowered his hood to reveal tired but kind blue eyes. "I saw your vehicle back on the road," the man said, his voice gravelly but steady. "Storm like this is no place to stop unless you're in trouble." He introduced himself as Walter Briggs, a retired ship mechanic who had lived in Port Hawkins his entire life. Walter's broad hands, cracked from years of work, gripped his walking stick as if it were an extension of himself. His posture suggested both age and experience battling these storms. Luke explained quickly but clearly what he had found. Walter frowned deeply, his brows knitting. "A woman named Emily, you said. With a boy?" He shook his head. There was a report this morning. Someone saw a woman and child near the coastal ridge before the storm worsened. No one's seen them since. Luke felt the snow tighten around them like a closing hand. The tracks leading deeper into the woods now took on a heavier meaning. Walter leaned down to the sled, examining the disturbed snow. If she went this way, she was heading toward the cliffs. The wind cuts through there like a knife. Luke nodded. I'm going after her. Walter hesitated. The ridge is dangerous in this weather. Luke glanced at the mother dog, then at the 4 fragile puppies in his coat. So is leaving her out there alone. Walter studied him for a long moment, then sighed and tightened his grip on his stick. Then I'm coming with you. I may be old, but these woods still know my steps. Luke didn't argue. Time was slipping, the storm was growing, and somewhere ahead, a woman who had fought to save her dogs might be fighting for her own life. He lifted the smallest pup closer to his chest, braced himself against the wind, and signaled Bear to lead the way. The mother dog limped beside him, guided not by strength, but by will. Together, the unlikely group stepped into the deepening veil of snow, chasing the fragile line of tracks before they vanished completely. And so the chapter ends, not with certainty, but with the first desperate march toward the truth hidden beyond the falling storm. The wind along the coastal ridge had grown sharper, slicing sideways through the trees as Luke, Bear, and Walter pressed deeper into the frozen forest. The snowfall thickened again, coating the branches in uneven sheets of ice that cracked whenever the wind twisted through them. Luke walked with urgency, every step sinking half a foot into the untouched drifts, while the 4 puppies bundled within his coat quivered under the weight of the cold. The mother dog trudged close to his leg, limping heavily but refusing to fall behind. Her breaths came in ragged bursts, yet her eyes, dark and full of instinct, remained fixed on the direction Bear seemed determined to follow. Luke felt the tug of their fear as if it ran through a single invisible thread binding them all. Walter walked a few paces behind, leaning on his sturdy wooden stick, his breath forming warm clouds in the frigid air. His steps were slow but steady, his years of navigating these woods allowing him to keep pace despite the storm. Though past 60, his tall frame and broad shoulders showed traces of the strength he once wielded working the shipyards. His face carried the lines of an old grief, the kind that stays silent. He had lost his wife decades ago to an early illness, and from that day forward had chosen to live simply, quietly, doing odds and ends for neighbors while avoiding deeper connections. But this situation stirred something in him, a memory of vulnerability and desperation he once lived through. Emily reminded him, in a way, of his late wife, gentle, brave, and loving fiercely. Luke paused near a fallen log and pressed 2 fingers to the comm device clipped to his jacket, raising his voice above the storm. Port Hawkins PD, this is Sergeant Luke Harper. I need confirmation on a missing persons report. Emily Dawson, 34, dark blonde hair, medium build, and a child approximately 7 years old. The reply crackled through static until a steady male voice broke through. Copy that, Sergeant. Emily Dawson was reported missing 36 hours ago. Vehicle found at the edge of Harbor Cliff. Heavy damage from collision. No footprints leading away from the car. Search halted due to blizzard conditions. I repeat, no signs of survival. Luke swallowed, his jaw clenched with frustration. Not signs of survival meant nothing when a storm erases footprints within minutes. Any details on the child? He asked, turning his eyes toward Bear, who sniffed the wind with deep concentration. Name is Noah Dawson, the dispatcher answered. 7 years old, last seen wearing a green winter jacket and a blue knit cap. He was with his mother at the time of the accident. Family says they were heading toward the shoreline to meet a relative. Walter exhaled a heavy breath as the transmission ended. 36 hours in this cold, he muttered. It's a miracle if they made it this long. Luke adjusted the scarf covering the smallest puppy's body and looked down at Bella, who gazed back at him with an expression that felt painfully human, hope mixed with dread. She didn't abandon them, Luke murmured. She must have carried these pups as far as she could. His voice softened as he stroked Bella's head. She was trying to bring them somewhere safe. Walter nodded grimly. A mother's will can cut through blizzards. Seen it before, in people and in animals. Bear suddenly stopped in the middle of the path. His ears pricked high, his body rigid with awareness. He let out a low, trembling howl. It echoed through the frozen trees like a flare cutting the darkness. Luke recognized it at once. Not danger, not prey. A detection howl. Something living was ahead. He shifted the puppies carefully, tightening his hold on the smallest one, then gestured toward Walter. Stay close. If there's a ledge ahead, the ground could be unstable. As they walked, the terrain grew steeper. Snow shaped itself into uneven ridges, and the faint sound of waves crashing far below told Luke the cliff's edge was near. Bella limped faster, her anxiety increasing with every step, and Bear kept his nose close to the wind, guiding them like a compass toward a truth waiting in the storm. They reached a spot where the trees thinned and the ground dipped sharply. Luke felt his boot slide slightly, testing the ground with caution. Bear approached the slanted edge and barked, sharp, clear, and full of urgency. Luke knelt and saw faint drag marks disappearing over the ledge. Not footprints. Someone had slid or crawled down. His heart thudded hard against his ribs. She went down here, he said. Walter peered over the ridge, gripping his stick tightly. The drop isn't far, but the wind's brutal. Someone climbing that with a child. She must have been desperate. The mother dog let out a strangled whine and lay down on the snow, staring into the gorge below. Luke rested a palm on her head. Easy, girl. We're going. He spotted a narrow decline carved naturally between two jagged rocks, just wide enough for a careful descent. He secured the pups inside his coat, ensuring they were snug against his body. Walter handed him a length of rope from his pack, a habit of his shipyard years. You'll need this, the old man said. Luke nodded gratefully. He tied the rope around his waist, securing the other end to a rooted pine, and began lowering himself down. The icy rock scraped against his gloves, and the wind whipped hard enough to jolt him sideways. Bear barked above, pacing anxiously, while Walter leaned over to monitor Luke's progress. The descent was treacherous, but Luke's training kept him composed. He moved slow, deliberate, placing each foot in a crevice and gripping each outcrop firmly. Halfway down, he saw something. A scrap of fabric caught on a branch. It was blue wool, a child's hat. Luke reached for it, his breath tightening. Noah had been there. He pushed lower, deeper into the frozen shadows of the drop. Then, finally, he saw it. A narrow outcropping sheltered beneath a rock overhang, and on it lay two shapes pressed together. Emily Dawson and her son. Emily's once soft face was drained of color, her lips blue from the cold. Her hair, tangled and wind-battered, clung to her cheeks in icy strands. She wore a worn gray coat, torn at the shoulder, and her arms were wrapped protectively around Noah's small frame. Noah, limp from exhaustion and cold, had his face buried in her chest. His cheeks were pale, but Luke saw the faint rise and fall of his breathing. Emily's eyes opened slightly as Luke reached them. They were the same warm brown as in the photograph, but now dulled by pain and fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of freezing air. "My boy." Luke rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I've got you, both of you. You're safe now." She let out a trembling breath. Not relief exactly, but the release of a burden she had carried beyond her limits. Luke tightened the rope and began preparing both for the ascent, knowing every second counted. And so the chapter ends, with the storm raging above, and Luke preparing to pull a broken mother and her fragile child back into the world of the living. The storm roared against the cliffside like an angry tide as Luke tightened the rope around Emily's waist, his fingers burning from the cold, yet moving with a steady precision forged through years of combat training. Snow blasted sideways, stinging his cheeks and blurring the world into shapes that shifted unpredictably. The ledge beneath them groaned each time a gust of coastal wind forced its way between the rocky crags. Above, Bear paced anxiously along the rim, barking sharp, rhythmic signals meant to guide rescuers through the curtain of white. Walter held the rope tightly, his boots dug into the snow, his old arms shaking but strong enough to anchor their path upward. Emily Dawson, who only moments ago lay motionless on the ledge, now clung weakly to consciousness. Her dark blonde hair whipped across her face, strands frozen into thin crystals. Her skin, pale and wind-scorched, had regained the slightest hint of warmth after Luke wrapped his outer jacket around her. Her breath trembled at uneven intervals, but it was breath nonetheless. Noah, her son, clung to Luke's side under an emergency thermal blanket. His small face was red from the cold, his eyelashes dotted with ice, but his eyes had regained clarity, a sign his system was fighting to recover. Luke could feel the boy's tiny hands gripping tight onto his sleeve, as if afraid that letting go would plunge him back into the storm's jaws. Walter leaned over the cliff, his weathered face illuminated by the flash of a rescue flare he had lit moments prior. He shouted instructions to Luke, his voice cracking against the wind. "Keep her upright. Don't let her lean back. The harness won't catch properly." Luke nodded without looking up, adjusting Emily's position. Her body shuddered, but she managed to lift her gaze toward him, her brown eyes overflowing with exhaustion and desperate hope. "Bella, my girl, and the pups," she whispered weakly, her voice nearly swept away by the wind. Luke met her eyes, offering a reassuring look. "They're alive. All of them. You kept them alive." Emily's lips quivered into a faint smile before her head dropped gently against his shoulder. With Walter bracing the rope, Luke carefully positioned Noah behind him, secured by an improvised sling made from Luke's spare thermal wrap. "Stay close, kid," Luke whispered. Noah nodded wordlessly, his small chest rising and falling against Luke's back. With Bear barking above, Luke began the ascent. Every move demanded strength. Each foothold he sought crumbled partially beneath ice. The cliff felt like it wanted to shake them off, as if resenting the intrusion of warm human life against its frozen shell. Luke's muscles screamed under the weight. Emily's limp form, Noah's fragile body, and the precarious pull of gravity all tugged against him. But he climbed anyway, boots digging fiercely into each ridge. Halfway up, a sharp gust nearly tore them backward. Luke slammed, his free hand against the rock face, fingertips scraping painfully. For a moment, the cliff held its breath. Walter yelled, voice thick with fear. "Hold, Marine! Don't you dare let go!" Bear's barking grew frantic, echoing down the canyon. Luke tightened his jaw, forcing air into his frozen lungs. A memory flashed through his mind. Afghanistan, years ago, when a collapsed building threatened to take him and 2 injured Marines down with it. He had learned then that survival was a negotiation between will and fear. He would not lose that negotiation today. Step by agonizing step, he pushed upward. When he reached the final ridge, Walter extended a gloved hand. Walter's grip was firm, surprisingly strong for a man his age, and together they hauled Emily and Noah over the edge. Bear immediately pressed his body against Noah, warming the child with his thick fur while whining anxiously. Luke collapsed to one knee, breathing hard. Snow swirled around him as 2 figures appeared through the blizzard, members of the Port Hawkins Rescue Unit. The first was a tall man in a heavy red jacket, broad-shouldered with close-shaven black hair and a stern, square jaw. His name tag read, Lieutenant Mark Hensley. Mark had a long history with coastal rescues and was known around town as a no-nonsense leader who had spent his 20s as a smoke jumper, fighting wildfires in the Rockies until a back injury forced him to change careers. His eyes, deep-set and dark brown, flickered with urgency as he assessed Emily and Noah. The second rescuer was a woman named Sarah Keating, somewhat petite but athletic, with sharp cheekbones and ash-blonde hair tightly braided against her head. Her pale skin reddened quickly in cold air, and her green eyes carried both concern and the calm confidence of someone who had seen enough emergencies to never freeze under pressure. Sarah had once been a paramedic in Boston before moving to Port Hawkins after losing a close friend in an urban rescue incident, an event that pushed her toward quieter towns but never diminished her dedication. Mark immediately knelt beside Emily, checking her pulse. "Weak but present," he muttered. Sarah unfolded a portable thermal blanket and wrapped it around mother and son with practiced speed. "We need to get them to the transport now," Sarah said firmly. "Their core temperatures won't hold much longer." Emily stirred as Sarah touched her face. Her voice rasped through cracked lips. "Bella, where is she? My dogs." Sarah glanced at Luke, confused. Luke motioned toward the tree line, where Bella slowly limped toward Emily with Bear at her side. Bella lowered her head onto Emily's arm, whining softly. Emily let out a trembling breath, tears merging with the snow on her cheeks. "Thank God," she whispered. Mark signaled his team through radio. "We have 2 hypothermia victims and animals in distress, preparing for extraction." The storm raged harder as they loaded Emily and Noah onto insulated rescue sleds attached to snowmobiles. As they prepared to depart, Sarah placed a hand on Luke's forearm. "You pulled them out of there alive," she said quietly. "In this weather, that's beyond impressive." Luke gave a modest shrug. They were counting on someone. Anyone. Sarah smiled faintly. "Well, today that someone was you." Walter approached with a tired grin. "Not all heroes wear badges, son. Some save families in the middle of a cliff storm." Luke exhaled softly, looking at Emily and Noah as Sarah and Mark secured them. Bella remained pressed beside her humans, guarding them with the last ounces of strength she had. The storm winds rose, howling across the ridge as the rescue sled surged forward, carrying mother and child toward safety. And so the chapter ends, with a family on the brink of survival and a Marine who refused to let the storm decide their fate. The last breath of winter drifted over Port Hawkins like a fading whisper. Its once cruel winds softened into a crisp, salt-tinged breeze that carried the scent of thawing snow and distant ocean spray. 1 week had passed since the rescue. The coastal town, battered and exhausted, now shimmered under the gentle warmth of early spring sunlight. The ice that once coated the streets had retreated into narrow, glittering streams that flowed down toward the harbor like silver threads weaving through cobblestone paths. For the first time in weeks, people emerged from their homes without fear of being swallowed by the storm. Inside the Port Hawkins Community Medical Center, a modest two-story building of pale brick and wide, foggy windows, Emily Dawson lay resting in a recovery room painted a calming sea green. The sunlight touched her face, revealing the first traces of color returning to her skin. Her dark blonde hair, now washed and combed free of the icy knots, fanned gently across her pillow. She looked far more alive than the near-frozen woman Luke had pulled from the cliff. Her brown eyes, still rimmed with exhaustion, carried a new softness, a quiet gratitude. Noah, her son, sat upright in the bed beside hers, wrapped in a fleece blanket patterned with little blue sailboats. The child's sandy hair gleamed as the sunlight danced over it, and though his body remained thin from the ordeal, his cheeks were flushed with warmth again. His spirit, resilient yet fragile, flickered in his eyes each time he glanced toward the doorway, expecting someone. Luke stepped into the room. He carried none of the rigid tension he had worn during the rescue. His tall frame, always commanding, seemed more at ease now. His black hair, slightly longer from his leave, brushed lightly across his brow. His gray-blue eyes, usually sharp and vigilant, softened the moment they landed on mother and son. Bear walked beside him, his thick sable and black coat gleaming from the grooming the nurses had insisted on giving him. His amber eyes glowed with happiness as he bounded forward with youthful eagerness, his slight limp barely noticeable on the polished hospital floor. Bella, Emily's shepherd, sprang to life the moment she saw Luke and Bear. Her fur, once frozen stiff, had regained its natural warmth and sheen. Though still recovering, her body moved with a hopeful energy that had been absent during the storm. She pressed her head into Luke's chest, tail swishing furiously. Luke knelt to greet her, the corners of his mouth lifting into a smile. "You look better than I do," he chuckled softly, scratching behind her ears. Bella responded with a grateful huff, her breath warm against his hands. Near the bed, a nurse entered quietly to adjust the monitors. Her name tag read Maria, a woman in her early 50s with a rounded face, dark eyes filled with maternal warmth, and curly gray-streaked hair tied into a bun under her cap. She was known in town as someone who had dedicated decades to caring for others, gentle in manner but firm in emergencies. She nodded respectfully at Luke before stepping back out. Emily watched the scene with tears shimmering in her eyes. Her voice, though soft, carried unfiltered emotion. "If you and Bear hadn't come when you did, we wouldn't be here." Luke shook his head slowly. "Emily, you fought for them long before we arrived. You led us to them. You kept them alive. I just helped finish what you started." Noah looked up at Luke with a timid smile. "Mr. Luke, Bear saved us too." Bear, hearing his name, patted over and gently nudged Noah's hand with his nose. The boy giggled, a sound so bright Luke felt something loosen in his chest. Later that afternoon, once doctors cleared Emily and Noah for short supervised outings, Luke walked with them outside toward the beach behind the hospital. The air carried a chill, but the sunlight softened it into something refreshing. The shoreline glowed beneath the pale gold of late afternoon, waves rolling gently toward them with a soothing rhythm. Emily walked slowly, supported by Walter Briggs, who had insisted on visiting the hospital every day since the rescue. Walter's tall frame hunched slightly with age, but his steady hands guided Emily across the sand with cautious patience. His white beard caught flecks of sunlight, making him appear almost carved from the old maritime world he had spent decades working in. Bear and Bella bounded ahead, though neither strayed far. The four puppies, now lively and brimming with new energy, toddled around them under the supervision of Sarah Keating, who had joined them after her rescue shift. Sarah, with her ash-blonde braids swinging and her slender, athletic frame moving with confident ease, crouched to scoop up one puppy who kept tripping over its own paws. The pale tone of her skin flushed gently in the cool breeze, and her green eyes flashed with delight as the tiny pup nipped playfully at her glove. Mark Hensley stood slightly apart, arms crossed, watching the group with a protective posture born from years of leadership. His broad shoulders and square jaw made him appear stern, but the faint upward curve at the corner of his mouth betrayed quiet satisfaction. Mark was not a man easily impressed, but Luke's rescue had earned his respect. Luke wandered a few paces away, stopping near the shoreline where the waves rolled up to kiss the sand before retreating. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, staring at the horizon as if searching for something that had long been hidden beneath the storm. Bear sat beside him, pressing his warm body gently against Luke's leg, a silent reassurance shared only between warriors who had survived too many nights side by side. For years, Luke had lived with shadows, memories of lost comrades, of missions gone wrong, of quiet nights where guilt pressed against his ribs like frost. But as he watched Emily laugh softly while Noah chased after the puppies, as Bella rolled on her back in the sand, as Walter smiled with an expression he hadn't worn in decades, Luke felt a part of himself thaw, slowly, quietly. The storm had passed, but something deeper had shifted. Emily stepped up beside him, her movements cautious but steady. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and looked at the horizon the way Luke had been moments before. "I didn't think we'd ever see the sun again," she murmured. Luke glanced at her. "Sometimes it takes a storm to make us appreciate the calm." She smiled, a soft, tired smile filled with gratitude. "Because of you, we have a chance to start over." He shook his head gently. "Because of all of us, even Bella." Emily laughed quietly, especially Bella. As the sun dipped low, casting warm streaks of gold over the beach, Noah raced across the sand with two puppies clinging stubbornly to his heels. Sarah snapped a photo on her phone. Walter watched them with folded arms and misty eyes. Mark nodded approvingly at Luke from afar. And the world, for the first time in a long time, felt whole. Luke took in every moment, the laughter, the warmth, the fragile but real sense of belonging. He didn't know what came next, but for now, he embraced the fragile truth unfolding before him. Even after the harshest winter, life always finds its way back to the light. And so the chapter ends, with a family reborn and a Marine who finally allowed himself to feel the quiet warmth of hope. Sometimes the greatest miracles in life do not arrive with thunder, lightning, or trumpets from the heavens. Sometimes they come quietly, in the shape of a loyal dog who refuses to give up, a child who holds on a little longer, a mother who shields her family with every breath she has left, or a Marine who listens to a call he cannot explain. In the middle of that frozen storm, when hope seemed buried beneath the snow, something greater than all of them was at work. A guiding hand, a whisper of strength, a shield of protection. For those who believe, it is easy to see that God was there long before the rescuers arrived. He was in the instinct of Bella, leading Luke through the storm. He was in the courage of Noah, holding on through the cold. He was in the steadfast loyalty of Bear, refusing to leave anyone behind. And he was in Luke's heart, urging him not to turn away when others might have. Life reminds us again and again that even in our darkest winters, the Lord sends warmth in the form of people and animals who show up exactly when we need them most. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of God's quiet miracles, or of the times He carried you through storms you never thought you could survive, please share this video with someone who could use a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or share your own story of a moment when you felt God's protection. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to this channel so together we can spread more stories of faith, compassion, and the gentle miracles that still happen around us every day. May God bless you, your family, your loved ones, and every soul who finds shelter in His grace. And may His protection be with you through every storm ahead.